So welcome to this double lecture, which is concerned with the concept and history of liberation. It's my pleasure to welcome two speakers today. Dr. Ruy Martínez Andrade. He will speak about liberation theology, liberation sociology, and liberation philosophy in Latin America and the Caribbean. Then second, Professor José Castiano will speak about liberation movements on the African continent. Let me briefly introduce the first speaker. Dr. Ruy Martínez Andrade received his PhD in sociology from l'École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. He currently holds the position of scientific collaborator at Universität Catholique de Louvain, Belgium. In 2009, he won the first international test prize, Think Against Current, awarded by the Cuban Book Institute, the Ministry of Culture of Cuba, and the Social Sciences edition. His most recent books, because there are many, include Dialectique de la modernité et socialisme indo-américain, published with L'Harmattan in 2023, and Teoria Crítica Anticolonial, Ensayos de Historia Intelectual, and you can correct me with my pronunciation, also published in 2023. He is also co-editor of several volumes, including Decolonizing Liberation Theologies, Past, Present, and Future, published with Palgrave. So I am looking forward to his talk with the title, From Dependency to Liberation. The floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank my colleague and friend, Dr. Abed Canor, for inviting me to participate in this lecture series, Transatlantic Resonance. My lecture is divided into 5 parts. First, I will address the debate surrounding the concept of dependency. Next, I will highlight the influence of the Cuban Revolution on the transformation of social thought. Then, I will discuss the main contribution of liberation sociology and liberation theology. In the fourth part, I will focus on the figure of Paulo Freire, and finally, I will discuss the thought of José Carlos Mariátegui, the Peruvian thinker. The 50s were not only the period during which Europe, with the help of the Marshall Plan, aligned itself with the principle of the North Atlantic, but also the time when the terms colonizer and colonized were replaced by developed and underdeveloped. In 1955, the Bandung Conference was held, at which the concept of the Third World was central. Coined in 1952 by Alfred Sobey, the term Third World referred to underdeveloped countries. It is important to note that the participants at the Bandung Conference condemned all forms of colonialism and imperialism. It's important to note that in the 50s, the work of economist Albert Hirschman began to challenge conventional development theory. Based on his fieldwork in Colombia, Hirschman observed that the guidelines proposed by the World Bank were actually increasing inequality. Consequently, Hirschman proposed the notion of possibilities to emphasize that development cannot be linear. True, Hirschman did not break with the vision of development, but his work marked a step toward descent from of dominant orthodoxy. The 60s gave way to what the United Nations called the Decade of Development. In Latin America, a group of research began to analyze the unequal exchange between the center and the periphery on the world system. According to this research, the emergence of the capitalist war system in 16th century gave rise to some of extraction. Drawing on an analysis of the imperialist process, this research proposed the concept of dependency to describe the socioeconomic structure of Latin America and Caribbean. With dependency theory, we can identify two tendencies of thought. One was reformist, arguing that certain reform could be implemented within the framework of liberal society. The revolutionary tendency, however, maintained that the only way to end poverty and destitution was through revolutionary change. You remember even Fernando Henrique Cardoso became a president of Brazil and applied the neoliberal policies in Brazil. The Cuban Revolution in 1955-9 was pivotal not only in bringing about a shift in mindset among many generations of activists, but also in transforming social thought. Indeed, the Cuban Revolution demonstrated that it's through praxis that people can transform not only their social struggles, but also their own subjectivity. Beyond the voluntarist discourse to which the Cuban Revolution has been reduced, his impact can be seen in the emergence of critical movements such as Orlando Falsborda's sociology of liberation, liberation theology, and pedagogy of oppressor. Orlando Falsborda, as you know, founded the sociology department in Bogotá, in the Universität Nacional de Bogotá. During the 50s, the social sciences were dominated by structural and functionalism. Indeed, the positivist perspective reduced individuals to actors. In Colombia, for example, thanks to the work of sociologist Orlando Falsborda and priest Camilo Torres, the Marxist perspective began to be introduced to explain the cause of poverty, social inequalities, and, of course, colonialism or neocolonialism. The debate surrounding dependency gave way to a debate surrounding liberation. Hence, Orlando Falsborda proposed a sociology of liberation. Following in the footsteps of Max Horkheimer, Falsborda believed that science had to move away from his traditional role and become an instrument of social transformation, a critical theory. You remember the famous conference by Horkheimer in 1934 that he distinguished traditional theory with critical theory. Michael Löwy distinguished between liberation theology and liberation Christianity to explain the socio-historical movement of the late 60s in Latin America. For him, liberation Christianity is a deeper phenomenon which also includes Protestant and allow the emergence of liberation theology in early 1970s. Because usually when we talk about liberation theology, people think that it's only in the Catholic groups. And for example, Rubén Alves, who is the first theologian who talked about beyond liberation, towards to liberation theology, it's a Protestant theologian. The movement on Christian liberalism for Löwy, these movements involve significant sectors of the church: priests, religious order, bishop, lay religious movements as young Christian worker, popularly based pastoral network, Christian-based community. The particular historical constellation that allowed the emergence of liberation Christianity was first the internal transformation of the church with the election of Pope John XXIII, which contributed to the creation of the Vatican Council II, and moreover, the triumph of Cuban Revolution through its anti-imperialist agenda. It opened up the cycle of social struggles and popular uprising. Although we have no doubt that liberation theology is not an homogeneous current of thought, we sustain that his matrix or mythological, ontological, ethical nucleus, as Paul Ricoeur said, is mediated by liberating critical perspective. The work of liberation theologian caught the attention of academic world in 70s and 80s, but the outlook open remained unknown, at least within the European world. It goes without saying that liberation theology is not an homogeneous current of thought. However, there are features that are unique to this theology. For instance, the emphasis on social science and their integration to theological reflection. For example, for this theologian, poverty is not a sin that God sent us. No, it's a result of social structure. The condemnation of capitalism. Capitalism is conceived as religion. We can find an elective affinities with this essay by Walter Benjamin, Capitalism as Religion. So for these people, capitalism is an idolatrous religion. That is important, the distinction between idolatry and religion. The critique of modern bourgeoisie ideology, illustrated by the cult of progress and the quantitative conception of developed liberation theology, is a discourse of faith. Since late 18th, liberation theologies have underlined the idolatrous character of capitalism. For them, the central problem in Latin America is not atheism, but idolatry, as worship of false gods. Remember in the 16th, 17th in Europe, Mullmann and Metz talking about the problem with the atheism. And for this theologian in Latin America, the problem is not atheism, it's idolatry. Even Ernest Bloch in his book, Atheism in Christianismus, say that only a good Christianity can become a good atheist. So the problem in Latin America is in this term. Latin American liberation theology has always stressed that the essential cleavage is hardly between believers or atheists, but rather between oppressor and oppressed. Hence, the need to acknowledge the political and historical dimension of sin. Latin American liberation theology is diametrically opposed to values as a surplus value, accumulation as only goal, and the logic of profit. The obsession with progress defended by bourgeois, capitalist, modern, and neocolonial society. The idea of the God of life, dear, to this theologian goes against the idols, mammon, total market, invisible hand, capital. These are the cover of the most interesting books translated to English in the 18th by Leonardo Boff and Gustavo Gutierrez. Paulo Freire is central to understanding the link between popular education and liberation theology. Originally from the city of Recife, Paulo Freire is currently present as one of the main theories of critical pedagogy. For Brazilian scholar João Colares de Mota Neto, Freire's work is at the origin of what is now as the colonial term. Indeed, the thought and work of Paulo Freire allow us not only to rethink the role of dialogue in critical education, but also to articulate the main constitutive element of liberationist Christianity, in which certain value, solidarity, a struggle for dignity, social justice, shape a counter-hegemonic discourse and practice. Although the John Marx notion of alienation was important for the critique of phantasmagoria of capitalism, we believe that the theory of fetishism was central to the denunciation of capitalism as an idolatrous system. In the case of Paulo Freire, the notion of alienation is central in his work, Pedagogy of Oppressed. According to Matthias Prey's work, A Methodist Pastor, the emergence of popular education in the 16th coincides with the birth of Latin American liberation theology. In this sense, Paulo Freire is central to understanding this link. Brazilian scholar João Colares Mota de Neto observes a rupture in Freire's thought in his Pedagogy of Oppressed has his incorporation of Marxism become evident. In this book, for example, in Pedagogy of Oppressed, you will find, for example, the Marxist notion as oppression, exploitation. No? Before Paulo Freire didn't work this kind of notion. In the prologue of Pedagogy of Oppressed, it can be seen that the author addressed both Christian and Marxist to underline the role of dialogue with the people and, in accordance with some of Walter Benjamin's and Rosa Luxemburgo approach, consider that the subject of knowledge is the subject of the struggle. let us recall, for Liberation Theology, the process of conscientization is central to the politicizing disalienation of social actors. Freire contextualized the process of deshumanization suffered by colonized people. Drawing on the contribution of Frantz Fanon and Albert Memmi, Paulo Freire lays the foundation of an anti-colonial critical theory. Freire was interested in analyzing not only the sociocultural domination process of colonialism, but also the way in which the colonized adopt the value of the ruling class through internal colonialism. Like Frantz Fanon, Paulo Freire observed that harmful effect of colonialism on the subjectivity of the colonized. Indeed, the colonized are not assumed to be human beings, but a thing or beast. In this sense, Freire argues that self-depreciation is another characteristic of the oppressor. So we can see similar lecture of colonized process between Frantz Fanon and Paulo Freire. The sociologist Jean-Pierre Ride examines the importance of Paulo Freire's method employed by Christian-based community during the development of Nicaraguan Revolution in 1979. In the terms of emergence of a new political culture, we can observe the importance of Paulo Freire in the literacy and political awareness campaign of the first Sandinista government in Nicaragua, or currently in the Brazilian Landless Workers Movement. In fact, the Paulo Freire method is a pillar in the conscientization process of militant, mostly peasant, on this social movement. The role of Christian-based community and the Paulo Freire's method were crucial not only for the process of conscientization of the subject, but also for the creation of a new political culture. In Latin America, for example, of the social movements in Mexico, Colombia, Nicaragua, Argentina were influenced by Paulo Freire method. The book El Evangelio en Solentiname, The Gospel in Solentiname, by the priest and poet Ernesto Cardenal, is an example of the relationship between the process of conscientization, liberation theology, and social praxis. Liberation was not understood individually, but in community. From a reading of the Bible, in the light of their experience, the members of the Christian-based community experience a process of reconstruction of political subjectivity that lead them to participate actively in social, political, or community work. The pedagogy of oppressed developed in a context of a strong social mobilization and social struggle to transform capitalist society in the name of the defense of the concrete life of all people is one of the main references in the articulation between education and Marxism. It was widely disseminated throughout Latin America and was adopted by popular movements. It provides a foothold for a tradition that contributes to provide a theoretical toolkit for those currently struggling against neoliberal capitalism. In 1925, José Carlos Mariátegui not only founded the Peruvian Socialist Party, but also published the seven interpretative essays on Peruvian reality. According with May González, Mariátegui was quite specifically not an indigenista, a movement he analyzed critically and great detail. He saw the indigenous population as exploited and propertyless class, and he recognized the right to land as the key of his future liberation. Cultural tradition has survived among them which could allow for Marxists in the Andean context. Seven interpretative essays on Peruvian reality is the best-known work by José Carlos Mariátegui. This book is a brilliant historical materialist analysis of Peruvian history. In another order of ideas, we cannot ignore the text Anniversary of Balance, published in September 1958, in which José Carlos Mariátegui distanced himself from the American Popular Revolutionary Alliance and argues for Indo-American socialism. I quote Mariátegui wrote this: "We certainly do not want socialism in Latin America to be a copy or imitation. It should be a heroic creation. We have to give life to Indo-American socialism with our own reality in our own language. Here is a mission worthy of a new generation. We are convinced that the proposal of Indo-American socialists was crucial to confront the dominant current of the Third International and consequently to reject all type of Eurocentric evolutionists of the reformist tendency. Moreover, such a proposal can contribute to elaboration of an eco-socialist civilization for this millennium. José Carlos Mariátegui revolutionary romantics reject any attempt to reestablish a previous social formation, Inca Empire, for example, and without denying the tendency and latency that are found in some strata, indigenous community. This Peruvian thinker produced a dialectical synthesis between tradition and the present turned towards the future, socialist utopia. Thus, it is not fortuitous that the work of José Carlos Mariátegui has influenced the work of one of the founders of Latin American Liberation Theology, the Peruvian theologian Gustavo Gutiérrez. And well, I will show you my last contribution of Liberation Theology and Marxism in Latin America. This is my book published in French, English, and Portuguese. And with the colleagues from Latin America, 2 years ago, we published this anthology, and we try to discuss the new tendency of liberation theology on ecological issues, on racism, on unequal racism, structural racism. So, thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving this overview and introduction and trying to link some of the discourses. We have now time for 3 to 4 comments and questions from the audience before we hand over to our second speaker. So, are there questions or comments? Yes. I already saw 3.
Thank you so much for this very panoramic sweep of liberation theology, which has been very influential, as you know, globally. I'd like to ask, because this movement and theory has been quite, like I said, quite influential, right? And I would like to ask, what is the link with the development of the World Social Forum, which took place around a few decades ago, which was a global movement, quite influenced by this movement? And then what is the state of leftist critique of neoliberalism now? Would you say liberation theology and the school that you described of thought and movement has gone beyond what we are, the state of, has there been a connection? And then can we move further than the current critique and movement now? Do you think there's a hope in the Trumpian era for leftist critique of neoliberalism? Thank you.
Thank you. I think you can go ahead and respond directly.
Concerning the first question, yes, for World Social Forum, one of the organized was the Brazilian activist Chico Whitaker. And Chico Whitaker were part of Peace and Justice Commission. So they have a link, no, between liberation theology with the Social World Forum. That is clear. One was organized in Porto Alegre, I think, 10 years ago, more or less. But yes, there is a link. Chico Whitaker, I think, illustrate this example. Second question is interesting because, for example, in the case of Brazil, we cannot forget that the Workers' Party, the Partido de Trabalhadores, were created by the Catholic and ecclesial communities of base. And a lot of theologians, as Frei Beto, for example, Frei Beto was part of the worker pastoral. I don't know if we say that in English. Pastoral obrera, worker pastoral, and in the first government by Lula, Frei Beto was the principal organizer of this program, Fome Zero, Hambre Zero, Zero Hunger. Zero Hunger. And after 3 months, Frei Beto resigned because he said, we, Liberation Theology, fight for change social structure, for transform social structure. We are not we don't have this caritative perspective. And give money, give this kind of a scholarship, BOSAs, or social programs is only, charitable method.
Charitable.
Yeah. So when you practice charitable method, you have this dominant position. You give for someone who is level in a level under you, no? Liberation Theology mobilized solidarity, class solidarity. So he resigned and he said, as Liberation Theology, I cannot to be with this progressive government who is this kind of clientelism. Mm-hmm. We say that in English? Clientelism. I don't know if it's in the case of Brazil. For sure, we can talk about Mexico is another context, or Bolivia, no?
Thank you so much, Luis, for this talk. I have one question and both are questions. One is that, like, this is more recent, like, what is your take on the Humanitas that Papa Leon just published? And what is your opinion on himself as a pope? And the other is, I know you had a very short time, so I just wanted to know how do you see Enrique Dussel's work in relation to the authors that you mentioned? And thank you, it was very, very interesting, and yeah, that's it.
For me, the figure of Enrique Dussel explained the 3 most important currents in Latin America: liberation and philosophy, and liberation theology and liberation philosophy. He founded the liberation philosophy when he grew up in 1979, philosophy of liberation, 1 year after the Orientalists by Edward Said. No? Edward Said was important for subaltern studies. No? For us, for Latin America, this book, Philosophy of Liberation, published in 1979, is one of the most important for us. And the colonial perspective. Because for sure the colonial perspective is not homogeneous. Someone, as Walter Mignolo talked about, is not a current, is more an option, the colonial option. No? Mm-hmm. Ramon Grossfogel will say another thing. For me, between this group, the most interesting is Enrique Dussel. Dussel has a very interesting knowledge on Marx, for example. I'm not sure that you read Marx. Well, so for us, Enrique Dussel explained these 3 currents in Latin America, and he and the Dussel's work renew the critical things in Latin America, and I think even in the world, in Africa, in Asia, I think research are discussing the idea of, for example, ego conquiro, no? I conquest, no, as foundation of modernity subjectivity, analytical or transmodernity project as civilizational project. So yes, I didn't have time, but thank you for the question about Dussel. I think it's one of the most interesting thinker in 20th century and even 21st century. And for the new pop, well, I think it's so. It's very soon, we can say that. Very soon for say very something. Soon. Very soon for say something like by Leon, no. Mm-hmm. It was the same with Pope Francisco, no? Francisco who renewed this idea, this ecological approach with the encyclica Laudato Si. But on another hand, Francisco was criticized by feminists for this ideology of gender, of his condemnation of abortion, you know. So because there are, so in the case of Leon, I think now it's very soon. When someone asks him why did you choose the name of Leon, he said because Leon was the best friend, the Francisco's de Assis best friend. So maybe he will continue this social dimension of Catholic Church, no? But yeah.
Thank you, Luis. I have two questions. First one was very interesting for me, the influence of Fanon on Paulo Freire. The question I have is that, so as you know, for Fanon, the matter of skin is crucial, and so he almost writes also about the two metaphysics based on black and white skin. And so, and it means that part of his analysis is based on this of the color of skin. And so, Paulo Freire, as a let's say white thinker author, so how does it deal with the question of skin in his reception of Fanon? That is the first question I have. And the second question, so as the the debates around the négritude, the reception of the négritude in the French context, especially the introduction that Jean-Paul Sartre wrote, led to a critical discussion on the fact that for critical thinkers, European critical thinkers of that time, all forms of conflict and combat were part of the form of universal and general combat of the oppressed against the dominator. And so the colonial racial conflict should be also understood in this way. But the answer of the authors, like for example, Fanon or for example Césaire, for example, was actually the critique of this position, this universalist approach that is not just part of a general combat, but we have also nuances of differences, and there again the context, history, and also racial aspects and colonial aspects play a role. I would like to know, in the context of Latin America, if we can say between the theology of liberation on one side and on the other side decolonial or anti-colonial movements, something like this conflict could have been thought of or existed or not. It was just more matter of reconciliation than critique. Yeah, thank you.
Well, it's concerning the first question, it's interesting because Paulo Freire is from the northeast of Brazil. And in Latin America, but particularly in Brazil, the links between social class and color of skin or racial going together. It's not like Europe. In Europe, you can, when you talk, in French context, when you talk about race, you cannot accept, what are you talking about race, you know, no? In Latin America, the people from slum, bidonville, favela, slums, are descendants of African people. So there are poor people. Nordeste, so the link between color and social class is together. So I think for Paulo Freire, they don't. He has no problem to understand Fanon when he writes about the colonized, because it's the similar in Latin America and in Brazil. The racism and classism suffering by poor people, it's clear. You see, so I think. For Freire, is not a problem that the Fanon's conception but it was another thing in the Brazilian context, the role of Marxist. For example, talking about negritude. The negritude, we have here a specialist in African philosophy. The notion of negritude as mobilized by Senghor or the African thinkers is not the same like the Caribbean thinkers, for example, in Haiti, with the Jacques Rouman or Stéphane Alexis, who were a communist member of the party. In Brazil, for example, in 1959, the same year of Cuban Revolution, Clovis Moura, a militant of Brazilian Communist Party, wrote a book of Quilombos. Quilombos is exists in English, the name Quilombos, you know. Why? Because in 30s, in the anthropologist, in the Brazilian anthropologist conception, it was an anthropologist who wrote Casa Grande Senzala, Freire, I think it's named also as Freire. Gilberto Freire wrote this book, Master, Casa Grande, Master, and Slavery. And slavery, for sure, black people. For him, the contradiction in Brazilian context was master, white people, and slavery, white and black people, but black people as object, object. Clovis Moura said, in fact, contradiction is not Casa Grande Senzala, it's the house of master and Quilombo, because in Brazil and in Latin America, we had an important and long resistance tradition by black communities. So Clovis Moura, from a Marxist perspective, recognized the role of black communities as political subjects. In 1959, a lot, some decades before that, decolonial. So, but I think one of the factors is the presence of Marxists in Latin America. For that, I talk about José Carlos Mariátegui. Mariátegui wrote his book in 1928. A lot of things that the colonize is discovering indigenous people as revolutionary subjects. Mariátegui wrote that in 28. So, it's in the case of Freire, Fanon. So I think the Caribbean Marxists as Jacques Rouman, even René de Pestre, the poet, they have another lecture by negritude. For them, negritude, I think, is different than the African thinker as Leopold Senghor.
Yeah, actually, next week we will have a lecture on negritude, so you can then expand this discussion. We have 3 more questions for you before we move to our second speaker.
Yeah, thank you very much for your lecture and giving us this overview. I would like to ask you, what do you think how sustainable or influential were the ideas of Paulo Freire and other thinkers which you presented here now? The background of my question is that you said, yeah, of course, Paulo Freire in his time was influential on also political parties and governments. And all of us here, of my generation at least, we have been reading Freire in the 1980s, beginning of 1990s, and Cardinal, and we were excited about the Sandinistas, etc. But given the development in Brazil to a right-wing government, many years Bolsonaro, given the fact that the Sandinista Daniel Ortega changed to become a kind of dictator, so how sustainable were or are these ideas developed by this generation of thinkers which you presented to us here?
Each year in Brazil, each year the Brazilian communities organize fraternity campaign, a campaña da fraternidade, fraternity campaign. All the subjects are social subjects. For example, Amazonia, the commons, water, agrarian reform. You see, it's a bigger campaign organized for sure by a lot of charge, but always the subject, the thematic is a social thematic. They not talk about, I don't know, the pub or the divinity question. No, it's a social issue. A lot of these people continue to work or apply the Freire's method, for example, for organize the organized communities in slums, not only in the rural or urban zone. I mentioned, for example, MST, Landless Movement, peasant without land, who is fighting for agrarian reform. I remember at the time in the first government with Lula da Silva, even if MST help Workers' Party, they take distance to the Lula's government because Lula prefer to sign accord, no, it's not trade, with the agribusiness. So these social movements continue to work, no, in his organization or in his land, no, to try to fight against, not only against the government, Bolsonaro, Dilma Rousseff, Lula, but also with the agro-business or capitalist monopolized industry. So the method is there, for sure. Yes, we can talk that in the case of Nicaragua with Daniel Ortega, but even Ernesto Cardenal and a lot of Liberation Theology was persecuted by Daniel Ortega. So I think the context, you say 18th. Latin America context is not the same and then the 18th. Brazil, for example, is under military dictatorship. Now we are in that the science, the politics name transition of democracy. But I think we can find in the bottom social movements the presence of Paulo Freire method and liberation theology. For example, fraternity campaign, in the case of Brazil,
Yeah, thank you. We may also discuss this later and tomorrow.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you for your lecture. A lot of questions, and I would like to hear you more about the concept of liberation in context of America Latina, especially in Brazil. When we look for Brazil, is a country that have a dimension of continents, so diversity in terms of race, for example, indigenous peoples, African peoples, in this case, in diaspora. It's important to emphasize that the most black population after Nigeria, for example, we find in Brazil. And how do you analyze the limit of the concept of pedagogy of oppression, for example, in perspective of our phrase, to attend the racial issues in context of Brazil. When we observe, for example, that the system, the society of Brazil, economic, for example, was building by slaverism, colonialism, for example, and despite all the struggle of the black movement in Brazil, for example, only 2003, for example, Brazil approved the first project to, for example, require the teaching of culture and history of black people and black culture and African culture history in different level and area in systematic education. And yeah, how is it possible to attend the agenda, historical agenda of black movement, black population, for example, in Brazil, in this way, for example, especially in concern liberation. Another point so important, when we look for the experience of Caribbean, Baina Bello, he's an important intellectual thinker in Haiti. He talked about the spiritual and cultural revolution. And in this way, IT have important experience in context of Caribbean and African, for example, although America Latina in context of Brazil, for example. And in this aspect, I would like to hear you about the role of IT in this aspect to promote the effective liberation, because IT have important important contribution in practice and theory, for example, to help us to find and systematize the mechanism, theoretical and practice to promote liberation in Africa and the diaspora especially, and when we look for Brazil in this aspect. Thank you so much.
First of all, I'm sorry, I'm not sure that I can answer you in a few minutes because each question is a seminary, so it's a very, very interesting question. The first one, well, we can not forget that liberation theologies were theologians. So for sure they were interested of the things in the religious imaginary, the soul. But Latin American liberation theologies are concerned by materialistic structure, poverty, and so on. One of the critiques that liberation theology received is that the idea of poor, the notion of poor, pobre, poor, it was socioeconomic category. For sure, the influence of dependency theory, the influence of Marxism, but one of the critics say that, well, it's an patriarchal perspective. Where is the role of a woman? Woman is not homogeneous category. Where is the racialized population? So in 18th, when theologians of liberation wrote, they talk about poor. But with the new generation, racialized generation, feminist thinkers, they become to change and not talk more about poor, but victim. There is a shift in the conceptualization of liberation theology. For example, Enrique Dussel in the Ethic of Liberation, he will say, before I talk on poor, now I will talk of victim. Because victim, when we talk about victim, you can point at the role of racialized woman, racialized population. Leonardo Bosch, for example, the ecological thinker, said planet is another victim. The planet, the land, the earth. Why? Because we are under the progress economical process, no instrumental reason. So planet also is a victim. So I think in Latin America, this last year, no, with the social transformation, no, I said 18th is not the same that this decade. So with a new perspective, we can now, for example, talk about that Black liberation theology, queer liberation theology, Marcel Althaus Rey, for example, in Brazil, this theologian Nancy Cardoso, who is proposing an queer ecofeminist perspective. We talk about indigenous perspective in Mexico, for example. We have the case of Samuel Ruiz and the Zapatista movement. So we have more new perspective in the case of the new proposals. Wow, Asian revolution. We cannot. How to say that? Thanks to IT, Latin America become independence. Why? Remember when Simón Bolívar, no? How do you say that? Nuestro libertador or liberator? Or liberator was expelled, expelled by the peninsular power criollos, was in Haiti. And in Haiti, I think it was the time of Pétion. Pétion, it was the name of governor of Haiti. Pétion, Alexander Pétion, said, well, it's very interesting your project for liberating Latin America, but you are not talking about the black people. And Bolívar said, oh, you are right. You are right. Yes, sorry, I didn't think about. And Pétion say, we will support. Pétion. Voilà, pardon. Sorry. And he say, we will help you, but you need to fight for freedom of our people. And thanks to IT, Bolívar changed his mind, and he say, nobody in Latin America could be a slave. So for sure, IT helped us materially, because he sent I don't know how many months with Simón Bolívar, but even to think in another way the revolution. For example, unfortunately in Latin America history, when you are students, we learn about French Revolution, Robespierre, Danton, English Revolution, never touch us about Toussaint Louverture, voilà. In the Caribbean literature, for example, in Cuba, Alejo Carpentier, for example, wrote a novel on Asian revolution. So I think this last year we are discover the role of Asian revolution. I think in philosophy world it was Susan Bookmore, no? Susan Bookmore, who wrote about Hegel and IT. Well, it's that, so maybe you know more. And in Brazil, yes, now I think they are discover the role of IT, but it was a demand of black community in Brazil.
Thank you for your wonderful lecture. Just like it's related to what Anke also asked previously, that the language of the conservative right wing appropriating the language of theology liberation is very, very thin. Because what we saw in Brazil was the same kind of language, the same kind of arguments that the liberation theology was posing and what the right wing is posing. And we see that this is not just limited to Latin America. This trend is something which has become more and more evident globally. Because coming from India, a lot of language of the right wing is based in theological language. What we see in America is also the same kind of language. And this past is this idealized past, which is like a very, what is the word? Romantic past. And then its impact on, the marginalized identities. Like, how do you see? So the feminist response to this language, what are the gaps? And also like rectifying these challenges and making the language not usable or amenable to right-wing kind of, language of control and authoritarianism. So would you just shed some light on this? Because the language is very similar, the arguments are very similar, but then how do we make that sort of distinction? Because the same kind of language is used to, control bodies, control sexuality, especially from women and other gender beings' lives. So how do you see that?
Well, language is a field of battle. Battlefield. Language is battlefield, general. No? It was interesting, for example, for instance, I remember in 19th, the first work by feminist liberation theology as Ivone Guevara, Maria Birgerman, for example, how to propose another lecture of the role of woman in the Bible or in the Catholic history, to try to recognize, the role of the woman in the history in general. And it was another theologian from Argentina, Marcela Altaus Rey, say, well, in fact, yes, it's interesting feminist perspective, but unfortunately, because Altaus Rey was influenced by Foucault, by Butler, say the problem with these feminists, they are in the framework of heteronormativity. Woman, you see, and he say, well, it's very interesting, this feminist perspective, but they are reifying the role in the heteronormative framework. So he mobilized the queer perspective with liberation theology. So it's an example that we can find the contradiction. I only talking of feminist theory, no? We have the same case, for example, in Leonardo Boff and John Monsung, for example, in Brazil, talking about ecology. For example, in the ecological discourse, a lot of thinkers say the problem is anthropocentrism, no? The problem is that Leonardo Boff, for example, said in some works or some books, the problem may be the modernity is anthropocentrism. But John Monsung said, well, if the system is anthropocentrical, why 18% of the world population is excluded? So system is not anthropocentrical. System maybe is lucrocentric. You see? So I think, and it's the question of language, as you say. So I think it's not only a battlefield, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you again. Dr. Andrade, please leave
yes,
me
for
the
sure.
microphone here.
For sure.
Yes, and it is my pleasure to introduce a second speaker for today. And I think some of the questions and queries may also come back. So our second speaker is Professor José Castiano. He's a professor at the Pedagogical University Maputo in Mozambique, where he holds a chair in African philosophy. Currently, and we are very glad to have you, he is a short-term fellow at the Löwy Center, and he will work with us on sources of philosophizing in Portuguese language, especially from the African context. Coming to Hildesheim and Germany is also a returning for Prof. Castiano. He actually earned his PhD from the University of Hamburg. The titles of his latest books are O Intermundo, En Busca do Sujeto, da Reconciliação.
Yes.
I hope after your months in Hildesheim, this will come easy to me. This was published in 2023, and he also co-authored several edited volumes. just to make a mention of one. Here is Philosophia Africana da Traição a Tradição.
Correct.
In 2019. Those who are not reading Portuguese may turn to his article in Philosophia Africana on the reception of contemporary African philosophy in Mozambique, or also in the journal Polylogue on African philosophy in Mozambique. I'm looking forward to your presentation entitled From Utopia to Dystopia. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I just want to start not to apologize as Africans always do because they are late or because of the language that is not theirs to speak. So I'm not going to apologize for my mistakes in languages, but I'm not late today. I want to thank Professor Anke Granes, the main idea of leading this project, Professor Birgit Bensing, Abed Kanua, Monica Cristina Roma, Stelia Muyanga, who is accompanying me and making sure that I am there where I am needed, on time and prepared. I recognize the presence of Professor Osha. I have read your book, Post-Ethno-Methodology. After I finished to write my last book, and then I'm still thinking if I should rewrite the book, taking into account what was in your book, in Post-Ethno-Methodology, because myself, I spent some times in Kenya at the University of Nairobi to research about Uruk and the ideas that he had in African philosophy. How do I do this? Yeah, okay. So I start by presenting my last book, which was here referred. The title is Intamuntu. So it's following the project of Ebosi Bolaga, and I recognize here a professor who was a friend and son of him. But why do I start here? Because last 3 weeks, this is a publication from Mozambique. So it is this three is made of guns. It's a project, peace project, that people collected guns to do art. And these three is in London. It's not in Mozambique, exposed. Maybe our next fight is to bring it back. But on your left side, my right side, is the same book, but today or yesterday published in Brazil by Authentica. So why I refer to this? Because between this one and that one, there were 2 years, and the Brazilian editors from Authentica, they sent me the book, and by rewriting, I had said I should have written the book now, not before, because what I'm going to tell is a kind of reflections after Intamuntu, the first edition. So I thought I should write before. What I'm going to speak is an issue that maybe in philosophy is on the field of philosophy of history, but it touches also the history of philosophy from an African perspective. Because of the time, I'm going through 4 to 5 aspects. The first one is a question: why are we Africans invented by Europeans, as Professor Mudimbe writes, and we do not accept that the birth of Africa is our own. And I will challenge this history that is made by one fact. The first fact is the 1526, when the first ship from slaves from Africa crossed the ocean, Atlantic Ocean, to America. And slaves inside of that ship were coming from different ethnic groups, different languages, and they did not understand each other. They couldn't speak each other. And the result, according to my opinion, is that they were united. They recognize themselves as not as having the same past, but as having the same destiny. So Africa was not born or invented by European, according to me. It was invented by those slaves in the ship that discovered that our destiny is unknown but is common. That is to challenge to see Africa as traditional only, as something the back, in the past. But Africa has been always, even today, a future, and not merely past. There were at all 12.5 million of slaves, or enslaved, it's better to say in that way, in the ships, around 37,000 ships that went to America. It was also the birth of racism. This ideology of racism, it was the one who supported, until today it doesn't disappear, the way to see Africans as source of working force to sustain the different societies in history, or also to see the Africa as the source of mineral, what can I say, material. So this idea didn't disappear, and I want you to challenge when you teach philosophy or history of philosophy, but the best one is the philosophy of history. You know, Hegel was the master of this idea. The second point, I want to challenge modernity, the idea of modernity that we teach also. This idea of modernity is always linked to Industrial Revolution, to French Revolution, and others, and also to the Aufklärung, the Illuminism, Kant, and those people. But it was here said by Professor, who was here, is Professor Luis Martínez Andrade, that Haiti has been selectively forgotten, and selective amnesia in history. That's what I call it. If you look, Haiti was 1804. The book of Hegel was published 1806 or 7. And during the years that Haiti was struggling to be independent, the first Negro or African or Afro-American republic, during those years, the book of Phenomenology des Geistes, or Phenomenology of the Spirit of Hegel, was being written. That is the thesis of... Yes. So, but maybe we suspect that he hid under this dialectic and master and serf. the idea background was Haiti, because in French Revolution that was not patent. So if you look at the philosophy of history, we can place as African and our perspective Haiti as the main historical fact that changed the idea of modernity. And there is another argument that I'm not going into today, that modernity meant liberty. If it meant liberty, the French Revolution did not result in liberty. It resulted in an imperial seigneur called Napoleon Bonaparte. But if you look at the Haiti, the result, although limited, but it was founding a new republic that spread throughout America, but also throughout later on Africa. The main let's say that mobilized the people in Haiti was liberty, freedom, or die. So you find in Mozambique, in Angola, in Guinea-Bissau later on, the independence or die. So this, I think it is the factum that should be placed, at least from the African perspective, as the historical fact to consider modernity as one of historical epoch that can be divided when we teach philosophy of history in our countries. The third aspect is postmodernity. We all teach about postmodernity according to the postmodern condition from Lyotard, and we torture our students reading this and not understanding what is meta-narrative, micro-narrative. But anyway, in my opinion, postmodernity should be started with the triumph of African liberation movements that changed the world. You were talking, Professor, about Bandung Conference. In the light of those movements, the idea of South epistemologies, the idea of independence, the idea of liberation, but particularly the idea of if you want to be liberated, you must fight, as in Haiti, for your liberation. No one will give you the liberation. If you look the whole process from 1957, starting from Ghana until 94, war with South Africa, you will see three different phases of liberation movements where this utopia of liberation started. The first one is 97 to 62. All these countries, Anglophone, Francophone. And then you have from 62 to 75 Portuguese-speaking countries. They were still colonized and they had to struggle, armed struggle to liberation. And most of us repeat the same mistake we do with IT, to think that just the slave, they took guns and started to shoot or to fight for their liberty. We don't think that behind this process they were thinkers. It was a platform to think about what should mean liberation for us. I will give you an example of the Portuguese-speaking countries. There are a volume of three volumes that was called, the title is Who is the Enemy? And inside is Amilcar Cabral, Eduardo Mondlane, Samora Machel, Marcelino dos Santos, and so on, who came together to answer the question, why are you fighting? Who is your enemy? The conclusion is our enemy is not the Portuguese people. Our enemy is not a white man. Our enemy is the system of colonialism. And that is what we should achieve, independence and liberation from this system. For today, it might see that this idea is easy to come to. But it was a profound thinking of people, of the leaders, to come to that, what can be for us a small conclusion, that to differentiate that we are not fighting whites, we are not fighting the people from Portugal or France, we are fighting colonialism as system. So what I want to stress is behind the struggle there was construction of liberation theories. We had some influences also from Paulo Freire and Guevara, Che Guevara. He came even to Tanzania, whatever. But the thinking itself, it was started by Africans themselves with the conscience that we should liberate ourselves. That's why, and I want to apologize for the decolonizing lovers. Nah? I don't speak about decolonizing. I don't speak, I'm liberated. I was not decolonized, and I'm not decolonized also. So I think our struggle as African is to stress that it's liberation and not decolonizing. I understand the context of those old discussions, but I don't think for the African reality is the proper concept. And then I will come to the last about dystopia. So my title is From Utopia, and Utopia is Liberation, to Dystopia. The liberation movements everywhere in Africa, and some exceptions they had three big deceptions that I want to just discuss with you and finish my presentation. One is that independences did not convert itself in liberties. So we fought for liberation. And when we mean liberation, it's a collective liberation as a country. But after the day one to today, the fight for liberties, religious liberty, political liberty, movement liberty, all those liberties, all those freedoms, they are still being a challenge for our liberation movements. They started to become a kind of dystopia, a kind of a political thinking when you think about Africa. The second one is that independencies did not convert themselves in social development. So we still have hunger, we still suffer and what they called underdevelopment, misery, a lot of people who do not have shelter. Although the promise of the independence, it was development. This is a problem because, for instance, in my country, you have out of let's say 100% of internal national production is consumed only by 15 or 20% of people. So 15 to 20% consume 80% of the total production, and other way around, the 80% of the population had consumed only 20%. What do I want to say about with that is that the social injustice, inequalities is very high, and that is is a problem for developing democracy. How can you develop a democracy in the case that people do not eat, they are hungry? How can you develop education in such a way that children go to school without food? And I think that is, if you want to be true philosophers in that context, that is what we should target also as philosophers. And last but not least, Independencies focused on the majority of the people, the language as people, majority. But they had serious problem to deal with minorities, with diversity, with political diversity, with cultural diversity, say even with gender diversity. That is still a challenge. So when I look into 60s, when I look back into 60s, or in my country 75, or in South Africa, Namibia, Zimbabwe in the 80s, were later these three countries, when I look back, the promises of better future, the promise of liberation, the promise of prosperity is still open, is still a big problem because of these three deceptions I have. But I'm not going to finish without saying something good about Africa. So that's why I wrote this book, and the undertitle is, it means intermuntu means subject. Muntu is a subject, you know, from Ebosibolaga, the Kris, the Muntu. But with intermuntu, I want to stress the condition that Africans had since not only the Portuguese or European came, but also before we had visitors from India, from China, before they come. So that condition, that receiving people from Asia, receiving people from Europe and everywhere in the world, it gave the African the capacity to deal with different cultures, to deal with diversity without losing his self-identity. I like, in my country, when we organize a wedding, the first day we go to a traditional ceremony. It is called lobola, where the family of the husband, the future husband, pays money, dot, in Portuguese it's called dot, to the woman. It's not selling, it's the respect. Okay? And on the second day, the following day, we go to a church, so whether Catholic or Muslim, and we make again, after the traditional, a new marriage under God. The same day after the church or mosque, we go to eat somewhere in a saloon. And when you ask, where did you get married, they don't say in the church or whatever, they say in that saloon. But before we go to the saloon, we go to a formal marriage, to the city hall, where we sign, whatever. So if you see that ceremony, or if you take other ceremonies, you will see that the African condition I would say also natural, more or less, is an interrelationship, is intercultural, is interreligious, is interpolitical, is the condition that is a category intermonto that wants to display that historical condition. In that book, I started to see the intermonto in religiosity, not religion. Second chapter, it was in politicity, so politics. And third chapter, it was in epistemology. So that's where I went to Oruka as the one who tried to combine, to synthesize a professional philosophy with sage philosophy, popular wisdom, that's whatever you want to like about it. So I will finish here and wait for our and keen for discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This morning you told us that you have been teaching for a long time and that you truly enjoy it, and I felt you were truly enjoying your lecture, and I'm sure that there are questions and comments from the audience because you had some provocative statements as well. So the floor is open for questions and comments. Yes, I saw 2 hands so far.
Yeah, thank you so much for this very nice lecture, and also for this hypothesis which you presented here. So a lot could be said now. Maybe we can deepen the discussion tomorrow in the research talk, but at least today I would like to ask the question, what are the levels of liberation then, yeah, which you mean? I'm very sympathetic with your thesis to say, forget about the concept of decolonization, let's take instead the concept of liberation. But then I'm really curious, what are the levels of liberation? So you spoke about a few here, social development, for example, but what I was missing, for example, but maybe there are more levels, is the level of, is the epistemic level, because this is a big debate in decolonization, yeah, the decolonization of the epistemic colonized frame. So what levels do you see in your liberation concept? Thank you so much.
Should I answer now? Or? No, I'm not going to answer. I'm going to debate. You know,
Yes,
Professor Ank. There's no cheap questions. But you are right. I didn't want to go to it, but the last level of liberation is epistemological one. You see, this, let's say, the epistemology of the South, from Professor Boaventura Sousa Santos, is, let me start the other way around. You have what was called here as Mudimbe, né? And you said Mudimbe, with the invention of South Africa, had to do with Edward Said Orientalism. And then, but if you look at the architecture of how Mudimbe and how Edward Said came to write about this, you will find at the back Foucault, you will find at the back post-structuralism as epistemology behind. So, but if you look at the geographical position of epistemology of the South, you see Portugal behind. Boaventura Sousa Santos in Portugal. And where is Portugal? Portugal is even in the periphery of of Europe. So, for me, it feels like we have to liberate ourselves of this, also this ideological epistemology. It sounds that it's adventurous what I'm going to say, but it sounds like it's Foucault who liberated us epistemologically. It's Portugal in the periphery that is liberating us for us to make our own epistemologies. That's why I'm sympathetic with Oruka, and even with ethnophilosophy, although with some problems. Because I think is the first point that we should dig on upwards for the epistemological liberation. Just to finish, I'm not going to speak about political liberation unless I spoke as a problem, but I stick in the project of liberation epistemologically. Ubuntu is seen as a traditional source or traditional way, ethical way. I am what you are. So that just as simply like that. It's seen also, let's say if I want to be modern, that it is just about ethics and not about epistemology, about the way how do you see a person, what is a person? We're discussing about this thing. So it's just packaged as something that is just for reconciliation in South Africa, the basis of philosophy. But we as African, we are not working enough, and I will go back what I suggested in the morning, to see Ubuntu as a critical theory, as an opportunity to liberate a African way of thinking and to put it in the world as the own source of epistemology. So I think in the case of Africa in the Ubuntu, ethics is the gateway where you should start to go to the other areas of philosophy. That's what it's my opinion. Although at first place is not seen as epistemology or as a metaphysic or other areas of philosophy, but that is the gateway, the ethic behind Ubuntu, and we can cultivate it as an epistemological source, as a metaphysical source also. I think the Ubuntu, what is philosophy through Ubuntu from Professor Ramos is a good start that we can develop. So far about what I think is the gateway for what we mean epistemological liberation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. My first question is a matter of curiosity.
Sorry?
My first question, curiosity.
It's
Curiosity.
curious.
Curiosity?
Yes.
Curious.
Ah, okay.
About the pictures of the books you show us.
Curiosity. Ah,
Yes,
okay.
curiosity.
Okay.
Yes. First of all, you said that in the first one there, you have a tree with guns. And the second, no more guns. What happened? With the guns.
Okay,
God
let me answer
disappears?
that before you go to the second, because I'm not going to write. According to my interpretation, I fought with I hope they are not listening to Brazilian editors, with them to introduce the same cover. You see, I fought, but then I gave up. I gave up because I found it beautiful also, the other one. with these color, African colors and whatever. But behind this, and I will use that opportunity to speak about our relationship with Brazil, Afro diaspora in Africa, and that is the issue, these sessions. I was talking to some of colleagues in the morning that when I go to Brazil, they present me as African, and then they say, that is a real African. You see, real African, because I come from Africa. It's a real African. And when they say real African, they mean that tradition, spirits, gods, is the one who's goalkeeper of this thing. You see, at the background. And then I start to refuse. No, Africa is not the Africa you left. Africa is developed. We have nations. You know, now we had a meeting, they called Brazil Africa, of rectors. I was very angry. How can you organize a meeting Brazil Africa? No, Brazil, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and whatever was there. Because Africa is not a country. But in the head of our Brazilian Afro-descendant, normal ones, Africa is a country. I'm not saying about Europe only, that is the other case. Africa is a country. So Africa did not develop. Some of the young people, when they come, they expect to maybe to see a lot of trees, no airports, no avenues, nothing. You see? So that is the problem that here is represented. The second one, which is more difficult in our relationship, is the problem of, how can I tell you in English, the concept of struggle. For Brazilian case, the concept of struggle is race. It's very important, race. And how do you articulate race, what you said, in class? And class, yes. See, for them. But when they come to Mozambique, I'm not speaking about Cameroon. When they come to Mozambique, Afro-Brazilian, they start to see a lot of racism. They ask me, don't you see this racism? I said, no, I can't see this racism. We are anti-racist. How can I see that? But the problem is that our struggle concept is poverty. Our problem is poverty. We have some kind of racial, social discrimination, but it's not the main one. So, but if you go to the world, you see that who is suffering is more or less 80%, 90% black. So I will come back and resume in following that what we have to start a dialogue with our Afro-diasporan intellectuals is to clarify this thing and to find a common agenda. And I will say common agenda against neoliberalism. Yeah, because this system doesn't work for us. Minimum state, I don't know what. Companies are richer than the countries, deregularizing, selling airports, selling natural resources to the companies. That system is not going further. So the response to that simple question is a big response to say behind this is that we have to go into more deep dialogue on our agenda and to enrich this initiative of intercultural or philosophizing in global and under the intercultural perspective. I think those colors, they are still missing, and who has to fill them? It's ourselves.
Thank you. Now, question and concise answer.
Okay.
Concise answer. Okay. Thank you.
I am very admirative with your audacity to challenge the concept of decolonization.
Okay.
So I will try to challenge your challenge. You quoted some political leaders as Amilcar Cabral, Samora Machel, and so on, with the question, who is the enemy? And to this question, the answer was, our enemy are not white men, are not Portuguese, but a system. Which system? System of colonization. So we can consider all the struggles organized in Africa and elsewhere as struggle against colonization. Is it not fair not to call this struggle against colonization a decolonization process? What is your problem with the concept of it? But I can understand that with the word liberation, you want to focus on another type, another aim, another goal of this struggle. We can understand that. But is it necessary for that to disqualify, to disqualify completely this popular, familiar concept of decolonization?
I'm not going to answer because I was warned I should not long, because the answer would be long. I'm familiar with the whole story of decolonization, from subaltern to whatever it is, the concept. But I think that is a discussion that we can have, and challenging me. But for this time, I have to tell you that, as I said, we are not invented. I'm consequent with it. I say also I'm not subaltern or subalternized. So the concept, the very concept that the core of this decolonizing is the subaltern, the lugar de fala, how do you call it? The space of speech. If it is subaltern, and I don't accept that. I'm not a subaltern. So we should resist to be defined in a negative way. That is what is behind, and it's still going on. That's problem. But as I said, it's a big problem. I started it to discuss in Macerata in Italy, and I was just thrown away from the room. And now, but it's something that I'm still working on it. Then it may be weak a bit, the arguments, and I recognize it. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Prof. I find this conversation quite insightful. From utopia to dystopia. That means from high hopes to shattered hopes. And I want to ask, I think you have partly answered the question, who is to blame? So we should blame the colonial system. Now, don't you think that there is also an elite agency at work? Is it not just the colonial system? What about, Africans colonizing Africans? Okay? And what is the way forward? It's like you have also partly answered the question by talking about intermuntu, or bringing in the intercultural perspective to bear on the situation. So can you please throw some light on it? Because you're talking about poverty and all that, and that poverty is a result of something. Mismanagement of resources, okay? A few people, plundering and collecting what belongs to everybody. So can you help us to throw some light? That problem is not just peculiar to Mozambique. It's a problem that is besetting almost all the African countries.
Yeah, because of the time, I will just shorten a bit. In this book, I don't only write about slavery promoted by European or Portuguese, but also how Africans themselves helped the system. They profited about sending the brothers outside. Sometimes the ones who were revolutionary brothers, they didn't like them. They were kingdoms. If you read the book of Africa, Stelia, como se chama of Africa? There is one book of Africa, this Nobel Prize from Nigeria. Ole Soyinka. Yeah, of Africa, yes. He writes about it, about a lot of problems concerning the selling slaves from the kingdom in Africa. So we had our own participation on that. But if you heard me properly, when I said deceptions, dystopia, I didn't go back to colonialism. I said the social injustice. I said we have problems dealing with diversity, political diversity, cultural diversity. Look, our states in Africa, they don't reflect the different ethnic groups. Only the elite, when they want to go to the power, they ask who is Aswa here, who is Sena, who whatever. But beyond that, you can't find a state which reflects on that cultural diversity. So it's a big lecture about that. And finally, I said, or maybe I have to add that today, when we started independence at the beginning, 60, 70, until middle 80s, when we went, our state's president went to visit somewhere, they used to take ministers of different kind of ministers. Today, if you look carefully, they look like Trump also. They take the how do you call it, entrepreneurs, business people. Yeah. You see, to China, Trump took business people from. I don't want to say the name of the companies now, but what does it mean? Is that when Africans go, presidential committee go outside, they go for business, and the business is to sell the country, to sell minerals. And now, moderator, I will finish with this sentence. And now, if you look carefully, the international companies, they discovered a new jewel from Africa. It's the youth. Youth. We have 60 or 70, 65% of population, they are youth. They are potential for the world tomorrow. And they have discovered that. But keep on saying there is unemployment, a narrative that makes you not to understand that you have a jewel. The president of Nigeria was speaking about it in the last summit in Kigali, if you listen carefully. So the youth is our strength. The youth is our strength to the Agenda 2063, number 7, if I'm not mistaken. And our youth, just to finish, we spend a lot of money educating them until grade 12. Some until they finalize the what you call it, licenciatura, is undergraduate. And then they are giving bursaries to go, and they never come back. So universities are now being an important source of recruiting human force capital from Africa. I don't say only for Europe, but even our brothers, Brazil. Because they discovered that this is a source working force. It's the same scheme like slavery, but in a more civilized manner. So I'm not blaming colonialism. I'm blaming our own elite that is linking always with those corruption, what I mean.
Thank you very much. I have a question about the intermuntu. I'd like to ask, so when I think about the Muntu by Ebussi Bulaga, so the main point is that the Muntu is not the universal subject, let's say. It is a certain form of subjectivity with a special experience, the experience of a crisis. And so, as he says, the fundamental experience of this subject is not the famous astonishment in philosophy, but it is, he calls it stupor, the stupor, is being dizzy, feeling just lost after a crisis. And so I would like to ask you, how can we understand this intermuntu? So is it also about a form of agency and subjectivity, and what is the difference between intermuntu and muntu? And can we also talk about a form of fundamental experience of this intermuntu, or do you understand intermuntu differently? Thank you.
Okay. Short is intermuntu is please forgive me. I know that there's someone here very acquainted with Ebussi Bulaga, but intermuntu was in my mind as the project to take the muntu in crisis from Ebussi Bulaga out of the crisis, philosophically. So, according to me, it should not finish with a muntu in crisis and so on. What do? You see, it's extremely only philosophical. So it's a category to say that the fact that we were colonized is not natural. What is natural for us is interrelationship, interculturality, interdisciplinarity, and also intermuntu. Intermuntu doesn't mean that the muntu disappears, the subject disappears, but his life has been always in contact with different kind of cultures, but also with different kind of societies in history. That they came to Africa, and suffering or not, but the muntu, intermuntu, he managed not only to survive, but to make out it a new world, a world of interculturality, a world of interrelation. Let me give you an example that I wanted to criticize. I hear always, and I don't like it, that Africans are between tradition and modernity. You see that debate. When you go somewhere, tradition, modernity. As tradition, modernity, where some boxes, you get into modernity and then you go into tradition. But Africans, according to the book, they have been webbing a new world out of this. So it's a disservice to say my sister is, because she's dressed today as a tradition attire, and tomorrow when she brings a good suit from Paris, then it's a contradiction of him. No, it's because she was born in those two worlds, and she's making out of it the best she can do in aesthetic, in epistemology, in politics, in all subjects of philosophy. That is the idea of intermuntu. And last but not least, intermuntu is the, if you see the undertitle is not here, maybe that side, there, né? Yeah, em busca do sujeito da reconciliação. It means in search of a subject of reconciliation. So it's a reconciliation with the different historical moments that we have, different people, different culture, that we can find in African society. Different food also, and different attires, color or not. So it's not finished. It's a project of building out from my friend from Mountain Crisis.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Monica. I would like to express in my first colonizing language, Portuguese. Lara, you can help me to translate, please. Professor, celebro com muita alegria esse encontro com o senhor aqui no Centro de Pesquisa Avançada em Filosofia. Muito feliz com a sua palestra, pelos aprendizados.
Obrigado.
Tenho algumas questões. O senhor, no início da apresentação, fez referência à África como o futuro. E nesta perspectiva, eu gostaria muito de ouvir o senhor sobre o devir da filosofia africana. O devir da filosofia africana. Nesse sentido, quando nós vamos observar a presença, a agência das mulheres filósofas, por exemplo, principalmente durante o período da luta da libertação, após a libertação, mas também quando olharmos para, portanto, o contexto comunitário, o papel importante das mães, por exemplo, as mulheres educadoras, que sempre tiveram papel importante na transmissão da cultura, desse pensamento filosófico genuíno, onde encontramos conceitos, categorias, essa base do pensamento filosófico africano, mas também olhar para a juventude africana, seu papel político importante. Qual tem sido o lugar, portanto, destas entidades na filosofia africana, portanto, no contexto de Moçambique, e não só, né, pensar a nossa região lusófona? Essa é a primeira questão fundamental que eu queria lhe ouvir. Lara, não sei se você gostaria de traduzir.
Okay, you want to...
Just first, so that
Okay,
everyone can
okay.
understand. So,
Yes.
thank you very much. I'm very happy for this encounter. I have several questions. In a general question is that you introduced Africa in the future, and so what should African philosophy in the future be? And especially I'm interested in the presence of women in the philosophy, especially in this period of liberation, but also like in the social world, the role of mothers, because they are the basis of African philosophy. So my first very important question is, what do you see as, what is their role in this African philosophy of the future?
There are two questions underlying this. First, the role of philosophy today, and secondly, let's say, women, youth, and particular people. The first one, the mission of philosophy has been always the future, better future. The mission of philosophy. When we look into political philosophy, epistemology, ethics, it's not the past, it's the future. I'll say, what do I mean with it is that to give some utopias, but not utopias as a dream, but the utopias that can give some kind of hope for the future. Although the reality is crude, but a philosopher should never desist on that mission. Otherwise, it will die, the philosophy. We can discuss about it, but the mission of philosophy doesn't mean it should not look to the traditions, what was, whatever. But again, tradition is not the past. The people who live according to traditional principles are not in the past, are today. It's just because you drive from the town to the countryside and then you're driving to the past. No, that is the biggest mistake we do in the concept of tradition. So they reflect. I wrote a book about with interviews with our old man Viegas. He's a sage. My conversation with him was not about the past. I didn't ask how was it done, what were the names. It was, how do you see democracy from that point of view? How do you see religion? You see, so it's a current issues that we can converse with those people. So the future. Secondly, and finish, during the struggle in Mozambique, women were part of the soldiers. Samora Machel had a say which more or less like this: the participation of women in the struggle is a condition, a necessary condition for its success. Without women, we never would be successful. And it was difficult to convince the men that girls and women should take guns and go to the battle. Very difficult. For me, it was the first act of emancipation of women in Africa. Not those, gender thing. But it's ignored in the discourse. And the discourse today says, yeah, the suffering, tradition. Look, I am the eldest in my family, and I have 5 sisters. I was never educated to undermine them. I was educated to respect them. I was educated to support them. And I was educated that I should do whatever it is to put them in front. I was never told that I should undermine them, whatever. So I don't know where does it come that in traditional Africa, women are subjected. It might be, but when it happens, it's the problem of these men. It's not the problem of culture. So we make that big mistake. We said, it's cultural. When she comes late, it's cultural. No, it's not cultural. She came late. When you harm someone, whatever, say the spirit is culture. It's not culture. It's just a crime. When a man beats a woman, it's not because my mother told me I should do that. It's not a value. It's not a culture. It's a crime. It's abuse. That is we as African philosophers, we should bring up. Yeah, not to generalize. And culture is never negative. Culture is the resume of the best values that our people has. Okay, thank you.
There are still more questions. I know
there's still more
Ruth has some more questions, Osiris has some more questions, Prof. Adesochi, but we will postpone those to tomorrow.
Oh, okay.
Thank you very much. And all of those who want to continue the exchange in a different format are invited to join us at a restaurant tonight at 7. Abed Cano already posted it in the Signal group, and whoever does not know, please approach him. And next week we will meet back here and also online, and we will host Hanita Vete Kongolo, who will speak, as I already mentioned, about longue durée négritude. So see you next week.
Did you like it? That's question of decolonization. I don't want to start it because it's that, but it's important to